There are places that exist beyond the boundaries of reality. Strange, forgotten spaces where time seems to stand still and fear becomes a silent companion. Among such places are abandoned restaurants, offices, or subway stations, long neglected and forsaken by the world. It's in these places where cracks in reality begin to appear, allowing bizarre entities to infiltrate our world. This is the story of someone who dedicated their life to working for an international organization that handles these eerie liminal spaces where reality and illusion intertwine. The tale begins at an abandoned McDonald's in the deep outback of Australia, where nothing is quite as it seems. There are places that exist outside the boundaries of our reality, strange dimensions governed by beings beyond human comprehension. Think of them as threads interwoven with our reality, sometimes piercing through and seeping into our world. You might have heard of liminal spaces, those eerie, transitional places suspended in time, hauntingly empty and inducing a deep sense of dread. Imagine schools at night, long winding hallways, or deserted indoor playgrounds with dim lighting. These liminal spaces often become sites where reality tears, allowing otherworldly dimensions to slip in. At first, these changes are subtle, almost imperceptible, until these places transform into something else entirely. I work for an international organization that monitors and, when necessary, seals these rifts in reality. Our main targets are abandoned locations that receive no human interaction or conscious thought, like deserted office buildings or disused underground stations. These forgotten, isolated places are particularly vulnerable to the influence of other dimensions, allowing extraneous beings to manifest. Among the various departments in our company, I belong to the on-site containment team, where we serve as the final line of defense against identified high-risk anomalies. I've spent most of my life in this role and recently retired. Throughout my career, I've witnessed things ranging from the terrifying to the downright bizarre, and it has taken a toll on me. I'm sharing my experiences now, partly as a record of my time in the field, and partly to unburden myself from the weight of these memories. As fitting, I'll begin with my very first encounter. The abandoned McDonald's in the heart of the Australian outback. I stared out the car window as the rust-red desert landscape slid past, occasionally broken by the low, scrubby bushes. My partner, Dan, gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the roadside for our target. Standard protocol dictated that missions involve 2 agents, one of whom should be more experienced if the other was newer. You might wonder why we don't send larger teams to handle these situations more effectively, but doing so increases the risk of disturbing and destabilizing the anomaly. 2 agents have proven to be the optimal number, with most operations succeeding, provided no one makes a significant mistake. Dan was several years my senior and wasn't much of a talker, so the long 3-hour drive had been spent mostly in uncomfortable silence. I tried turning on the radio about 30 minutes in, but he promptly swatted my hand away, insisting we needed to stay alert. The man was on edge even though we were still miles from the actual site. Finally, we arrived at our destination, an old abandoned McDonald's that had last been operational in the 1960s when this road was the main route to a now-forgotten tourist town. Dan parked the car on the roadside, not even pulling into the parking lot. It was a cautious move, one I wouldn't have thought of as a rookie on my first mission. As was routine, Dan stepped out first, surveying the area before signaling me to grab the backpacks and follow him to the building. The backpacks, courtesy of LimSec, were packed with standard military survival gear and specialized items needed to operate in liminal spaces and alternate dimensions. The air outside was scorching and dry, like stepping into an oven. As I exited the car, the sun's heat intensified, making my skin feel like it was being seared. Dan had already crossed into the parking lot, and was now scrutinizing the building as if expecting it to explode at any moment. When I caught up, he pointed out the oddities of the site. The first was obvious and sent a chill down my spine. The fluorescent lights inside the building were flickering. Keep in mind, this place had been disconnected from the power grid over 50 years ago. Just that fact alone was enough to quicken my pulse. The other anomalies were subtler. The parking lot spaces seemed too narrow. The trash bin at the entrance was overflowing, and the exterior was strangely pristine. At first glance, you wouldn't guess this restaurant had been abandoned for decades. "Let's get this done quickly. I've got a bad feeling," Dan murmured, leading the way to the glass doors. He pushed them open, letting me enter before placing a doorstop to prevent the door from closing behind us. You might expect the door to creak or the furniture inside to be covered in dust, but that wasn't the case. The interior looked like a standard McDonald's, complete with red chairs and thin wooden tables. But as I looked closer, more oddities became apparent. The two drinks sitting on a table in a corner, straws pointed towards the chairs as if a couple had just been there. A pile of crumpled napkins arranged in a crude pyramid on another table, with a small Ronald McDonald figurine staring straight at me. Dan had already pulled out an anomaly detector, which measured disturbances in particles and energy, like a radiation detector, but for reality glitches. The device beeped steadily, confirming we were in the right place, not that it wasn't already obvious. Our objective was to locate the center of the anomaly, the 0 point where the disturbance originated, and seal it using our equipment. The process is usually straightforward, provided the space isn't too disturbed. As we cautiously explored the area, eyes glued to the detector for any spikes, I started to hear a low humming sound coming from behind the counter, somewhere in the kitchen. I alerted Dan, who heard it too, so we moved towards the kitchen. I gasped when I saw the source of the sound. On the counter sat an old CRT TV, flickering with static. Beyond the TV, the kitchen seamlessly transitioned into what looked like an open-plan office, complete with cubicles and computers. As we approached the TV, the anomaly detector's beeping intensified. The transition from kitchen to office was sharp, as if someone had sliced out a section of an office and dropped it here. The tiles suddenly gave way to blue carpet, but where the materials met, there was a slight fuzziness, something my eyes couldn't quite focus on. Dan stopped me just as I was about to step over the transition into the office space, gripping my shoulder firmly. "No need to go there. This TV is the source," he whispered, setting his backpack on the counter and pulling out a pair of wire cutters. With them, he snipped the cable leading from the TV to the wall. As expected, the TV immediately shut off, plunging us into an eerie silence. A heavy, oppressive feeling settled over us, and I couldn't shake the instinctual sense that cutting the cord had been a mistake. Dan seemed to feel the same, though he kept his composure, sticking to protocol and attaching our devices to the TV to neutralize it. "2 more minutes and we'll be done," he said, securing a device to the TV that looked suspiciously like a bomb. I couldn't tell you how the technology worked. I still don't understand the science behind these anomalies or spaces. Everything was going smoothly until the humming started up again, louder and more intense than before, and this time, it wasn't coming from the TV. Dan spun around trying to locate the source of the sound, but it seemed to be emanating from all around us. My stomach dropped as adrenaline surged through my veins. The sound drew nearer, closing in on us, and then, from behind the counter, it rose. The creature was a humanoid shape made entirely of static, a kaleidoscope of sizzling black and white patterns. Its edges were indistinct, and its movements made it appear to glide through the air. Heart pounding, Dan grabbed my arm and shouted, "Move!" With nowhere else to go, we bolted into the office space, weaving through the cubicles to hide from the entity. We were armed, but our weapons were almost useless against something like this, like trying to fend off a T-Rex with a pistol. "You go left, I'll go right. Keep your radio on, Dan yelled. I nodded and veered left. The open office space seemed to stretch on forever, the cubicle layout forming a nonsensical maze. Each cubicle was identical: a black monitor, a keyboard, and a mouse. The keyboards, I noticed, had no labels on the keys, and there were no personal items or chairs. As I walked, the carpet made a wet, smacking sound underfoot, and I realized I could no longer hear the entity's static buzz. I slowed to a stop, surrounded by the endless cubicles. The feeling of isolation gnawed at me, and I glanced around as the overhead lights flickered. The air smelled faintly of ash and damp earth. I suspected Dan had distracted the entity from me, leading it away. Both were still somewhere in this place. I pulled out my radio, a small, discreet black unit with a special receiver and transmitter, and switched it on. Dan, do you copy? I called into the radio. I clipped the radio to my belt, trying to figure out how to navigate my way out of this place. I still had my own Limsec backpack, so I wasn't entirely helpless. But the issue with being this deep into an anomaly is that it shifts and morphs around you, making navigation nearly impossible. Still, I had a detector similar to Dan's that would guide me to an exit point. If I was lucky, it would be back at the McDonald's where we entered, or it could be on the other side of the world. But that was another problem. I wandered aimlessly until I noticed something: the wall of darkness. It loomed in the distance, surrounding me entirely. It was like being inside a video game with the render distance set to its lowest setting, and as I cautiously moved towards the black void, I couldn't help but feel it was alive, sentient. Every step brought me closer to the void, which now seemed to pulse and quiver in response to my approach. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the void. A man, tall and skeletal, his skin pale and his eyes empty, voids of black. He wore a suit that seemed to blend into the darkness behind him. "Welcome to my domain," he whispered in a voice that reverberated inside my skull. I tried to back away, but I found I was rooted in place, held by some unseen force. The figure tilted his head, observing me with an unnerving curiosity. "You shouldn't be here," he continued, and I felt my heart freeze in my chest. Before I could react, the void surged forward, engulfing me in darkness. I woke up on the floor of the McDonald's, staring up at the flickering fluorescent lights. My head throbbed with pain, and I could taste blood in my mouth. I pushed myself up, wincing as I surveyed the surroundings. The office space had vanished. I was back in the restaurant. Dan was nowhere to be seen. I stumbled towards the counter where the TV had been, but all that remained was a blackened patch on the floor. Shaking, I grabbed my radio and tried to contact Dan again, but there was no response. All I could hear was static, and that sound sent waves of nausea through me. I made my way outside, and as soon as I stepped out, the oppressive heat hit me like a wall. The sun was still high in the sky, and it was as if no time had passed. I didn't look back. I walked straight to the car, threw my backpack in the trunk, and drove away. Dan was never found. He was listed as missing in action, and that was that. There was no further investigation, no attempt to locate his body. The place was marked off limits, and as far as I know, the anomaly was never resolved. They didn't even bother to seal it. Years have passed since then, but I still can't shake the feeling that Dan is out there, somewhere in that twisted reality, trapped in a never-ending loop. These stories are rare, and though they haunt me, they're nothing compared to the dangers that lurk in those places. I'm sharing this now as a reminder that some things are better left forgotten, that there are places we should never go. After many years in this line of work, the protagonist finally dares to share the story that first led him into the world of liminal spaces. Even after all these years, the memory of that abandoned McDonald's still lingers in his mind, especially the mystery surrounding his teammate who vanished without a trace. Perhaps in some other space and time, Dan is still wandering in an alternate reality, never to find his way back. This serves as a reminder to all of us about the mysteries out there that we should never explore. If you ever come across a place that feels cold and alien, as if it doesn't belong to this world, it's probably best to keep your distance. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and if you want to hear more spine-chilling tales, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video.